Our next speaker is Pieter Vedder. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the name. He was born in 1929 in Arnhem in the Netherlands. He's the son of a market gardener. Studied horticulture, horticulture engineering, and teaching, and started to work for the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture in the Extension Service for Horticulture, especially glasshouse crops, asparagus, and mushrooms. In 1956, he became involved in the establishment of the new mushroom experiment station in Horst, and he became assistant to the well-known mushroom research couple, Peter and Jet Bells. From out of that experiment station, he did a lot of consultant work for mushroom growers and also gave a number of courses for beginning and advanced growers. When the mushroom industry in Holland was growing, there was a strong need for specialized training of young mushroom growers. For the Dutch government, he established the Mushroom Growers Training Center in Horst, from which he was director until 1983. Wrote a number of articles and publications in different international mushroom magazines, and his book, Modern Mushroom Growing, is translated into 9 languages and therefore known by growers in numerous countries. He was involved in many projects in developing countries, and as a consultant, he traveled all over the world. In 1983, he moved to the United States and accepted a job as Vice President, Training and Development at Campbell Soup's mushroom division. He is married and lives with his wife, Mariette, in Dublin, Georgia. Mr. Pieter Vedder.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here today. We all know that the environment in a growing room has a lot to do with the quality of the product we grow. We at Campbell's, we are more and more convinced that the success on the market depends for a major part on the quality of the product. Controlling the environment in a mushroom house, for sure, is a very important thing. However, that's not enough to produce a first-class quality product for a reasonable price, of course. There are many more factors, like the strain, the quality of the compost, including the compost moisture level, the characteristics and the moisture level of the casing soil, etc. We always have to look for the limiting factor in our growing procedures. Because we made too many jokes this afternoon, we have only limited time. Let me share a few thoughts with you just to initiate a good discussion later on. So, let's say a few thoughts around a few slides. May I have the first one? That's a good one. I can do it myself. That's okay. Let's start at flushing. Because the influence of the climate, the environment, starts for the biggest part at this point of time. First of all, we should never forget to think like a mushroom. That means think small, in terms of microorganisms living in a microclimate. Flushing means, as you all know, that we try to stop the vegetative growth by lowering the temperature, the CO₂ concentration, and increase the evaporation, etc. And then, as the result of that, initiate fructification. What I try to point out in this slide is that even if the climate in the growing room in general is okay, that doesn't mean that the microclimate, the environment around the young initials, automatically is optimal. Maybe there is already a certain ununiformity between the different trays or beds in the growing room. Some spots where the mycelium is already grown on top of the casing layer, and other areas where the mycelium is still trying to reach the surface. For sure, this will result in some clusters here and dirty mushrooms there. So, instead of changing the climate in the room, more uniformity at casing, better leveling, scratching, caking, etc. can solve this problem, for the biggest part at least. If the surface of the casing layer is sealed, as the result of heavy and perhaps somewhat late waterings, the microclimate for sure is not the same as in a more open, crumbly structure. Again, think small. Think like a mushroom. Think about it if you see some bare spots on your beds, or a number of odd-shaped, malformed young fruit bodies on the beds. A too-wet casing layer, let's say over 80%, will have more or less the same effect. The one-type peat moss seems to be more sensitive for the effect of sealing than others. This had nothing to do with the firmness of the casing layer. In total, I even prefer a firm, somewhat compacted layer, but I'm talking about just the surface. A very light scratching immediately after the heavy waterings and before flushing will help to overcome this problem for the biggest part. This picture shows another problem. Small, light, less good quality mushrooms, mainly as the result of overpopulation. We call that overpinning. The mushrooms are different, although the climate in the same situations is the same. Overpinning on certain spots can be the result again of ununiformity in the compost or casing layer thickness. It's also possible that the compost layer is too thick, fillings over 7-8 pounds of dry matter, so that at flushing we have to create a rather harsh climate to control the bed temperature and, as the result of that, have low enough CO₂ concentrations, etc., resulting in the formation of too many fruit bodies. Here again, although the climate in the room in both situations is the same, the environment around the young mushrooms is completely different. With too many mushrooms on the beds, the CO₂ concentration, as well the relative humidity and the temperature underneath the caps is much higher as in the room, with all the negative results, with all the negative effects related to that. I believe that even with the most sophisticated air handling system, it will be always very difficult to grow good quality mushrooms if a break yields, let's say, over 3 pounds per square foot. This picture is suggesting more or less the ideal situation. There is a good balance between bed activity and the environment in the growing room. The total amount of fresh air should be sufficient to keep the CO₂ concentration at the right level, let's say around 900, 1100 parts per million. At the same time, the combination relative humidity, air temperature, and total air circulation controls the evaporation rate, and this controls for the biggest part the bed temperature. We know that most biological processes go faster at higher temperatures. The CO₂ production, being a useful parameter to measure biological activity in mushroom beds, increases almost 20% for each centigrade temperature rise. That means that the CO₂ production almost doubles if the bed temperature rises from, for instance, 68 to 75 degrees. We could say it also this way. To keep the CO₂ concentration at the same level at 75 degrees, it needs nearly twice as much fresh air, twice as much ventilation as at 68 degrees. We need a constant evaporation to keep the transport of water, in which solve the nutrients, from out of the compost layer upwards going. Beside the amount of fresh air, also the total amount of air circulated in the room is very important, because we need a certain air movement to avoid big climate differences. A problem here can be that for the maximum cooling and or heating capacity, we quite often have to run the maximum circulation fan capacity, although the mushroom prefers a more quiet environment. On the number of farms, there is even no choice. The fan speed or the total amount of circulation air is not controllable at all. Often too, the problem is a poor air distribution, so that there is a real difference in the room between different areas. Blotch and scaliness are two good examples from what the result can be of a poor macro-growing environment. Scaliness or feathering is a question of damaged or even dying surface tissue from the still growing fruit bodies. We all know that certain strains are more sensitive for this phenomenon than others. One of the reasons that most of us grow a hybrid strain, for sure, is that the mushrooms from these strains are less sensitive for scaling or feathering than our good old off-whites. Nevertheless, our spawn makers, breeders, have still a job to do. Here again, it's not just the climate, although the climate plays an important role. The combination somewhat higher temperature and, partly as the result of that, lower humidities together with a high air velocity is the main cause for this problem. Also here, it's quite often a lack on uniform air distribution in the room, so that the air velocity on certain spots is twice as high as at some other spots. I suppose that everybody in this room knows that blotch is caused by the activity of certain bacteria on the surface tissue of the mushrooms on the beds. These bacteria develop very fast on mushroom tissue in an almost moisture-saturated environment. So, after watering the mushrooms on the beds, it is very important to increase the evaporation temporarily to dry the mushrooms in a couple of hours. Especially if we have to water somewhat late in the break, where the mushrooms touch each other already, it will be really difficult to avoid wet spots between the caps. So to avoid blotch, we also have to avoid dead spots in the room where there is hardly any air movement. Also here, it often is a question of, again, improper, poor air distribution. We also have to realize that the temperature differences have a big influence on the relative humidity in the growing room. If we have a relative humidity of, for instance, 86% at a temperature of 64 degrees, we should not forget that we reach already the saturation point if the air temperature drops till 60. Most times, of course, the problem is caused by a combination of the aforementioned factors. Last, but for sure not at least, we should not forget that although the climate in a growing room is a very important factor, it is only a part of the whole story about growing quality mushrooms. Even the most sophisticated computer-controlled air conditioning system will not help you if that stuff underneath, what we call compost, is not right. We too often forget that. The activity of vigorous growing mushroom mycelium in a good compost automatically results in a somewhat higher bed temperature, which creates automatically enough evaporation, etc. On several farms, they spent a lot of money on a high-tech, computer-controlled air conditioning system, although they badly needed first a better drained or covered slab. By analyzing production and quality problems over a number of years, we will learn that the limiting factor not always is the environment in the growing room, but more often the quality of the compost, which includes the moisture level, etc. Maybe you have heard sometimes the story of the parrot. Beside human beings, the only organism that's able to talk, to tell us how they feel. I think that story is appropriate in this situation here. A man who liked to have some company bought a parrot in a pet shop, and the owner assured him that it really is a good performer, a good talker. So he brought the parrot home and put him in a very nice and expensive cage. The parrot, however, didn't say a single word. The man went back to the pet shop and complained, of course. And the shop owner advised him to buy a small bell so that the parrot could play a little bit and feel more comfortable. And for sure that will help him to perform well and talk whole day. But again, not a single word. Next day, back again in the shop and complaining, the man advised him to buy a swing so that the animal could play a little bit, feels more comfortable and start talking. So he bought the swing, installed it, but how disappointing, the bird didn't react at all. Again, not a single word. Somewhat frustrated, back to the shop, losing almost his temper, the shop owner assured him that, in his opinion, the parrot still didn't like the environment, didn't feel at home, so he advised the man to spend again a little bit more money and buy a small ladder, because he said they sometimes like to climb a ladder and feel good, and then he will start to talk. And the morning after that, again back in the pet shop, the owner asked the man about the result this time. Did the parrot talk? Yes, the man said. After I told him that now I spent enough money and did everything to make him feel good, he finally opened his mouth. And just before he died, he said, right, you did everything on the environment, but what about some food? Thank you.